Hello and welcome to a very short half-hour discussion of the death penalty and restorative justice. I'm Msgr Stuart Swetland. I'm the president of Donnelly College in Kansas City, Kansas. But today I'm here on behalf of the Catholic Mobilizing Network. The Catholic Mobilizing Network was founded in 2009 as a way to live out the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops' 2005 Catholic campaign to end the death penalty. Through their work in the abolition of the death penalty, they have also begun to recognize the important work being done in various parts of the country on restorative justice. And we want to talk about both of those things today. Joining me is the chaplain at San Quentin in California, Father Williams, who is a Jesuit, and we're very happy to have you with us today and for the work you do, important work you do, especially on death row. And we have with us today an advocate for the abolition of the death penalty and for restorative justice, whose family suffered a great tragedy of the loss of a daughter as a murder victim. Vicki Schieber has, for many years, been advocating for our recognition of the humanity of those who others might throw away, and that is those who are in prison, but also the reaching out to victims and their families to help them heal from the terrible tragedies that have impacted their lives in oh so many different ways. And I want to talk first of all with you about your ministry. If you would just tell us a little bit, Father, starting with you, about your ministry on death row in California.
Sure. I'm the Catholic chaplain at San Quentin State Prison. It's a state prison. It's the oldest prison in California. We have 4,000 men in prison there, and of those 4,000, 750 are condemned death row inmates. And so I work as the Catholic chaplain, and that's basically my parish.
My name is Vicki Schieber, and I'm the mother of a murdered daughter. And that happened 20 years ago now. And what I have been able to do in some small part of this whole effort in the church's sponsorship is to work to eliminate the death penalty system in this country. Through the process of going through the loss of my daughter, and I knew nothing about the death penalty ahead of time, but I saw what it did to murder victims' families, and I saw that many, many problems exist in the system that people notice: the unfairness, the errors, the problems, the costs. And I thought that that would be the best way to honor her, since she was a person who really believed in social justice and wanted to make a difference in this world.
So you're carrying on her legacy in working against the death penalty.
Yes.
Father, tell us a little bit of what it's like spiritually for the men, because in your case it's men who are on death row in California.
Well, imagine living in a cell that goes from my shoulder to the end of my fingers. It's about 5 feet wide by 11 feet deep. It's about the size of many people's showers, and the men spend up to 23 hours a day in these windowless cells. The front of the cell is where the light comes in. It's difficult, and I think the hardest part is, they've all said to me at different times, waking up in the morning and realizing that society says, I no longer deserve to live, is a weight that they carry every single day. It wears on them. So I think spiritually, it's there's not a lot of hope there, and part of my job is to point to hope, to witness to hope, to purpose in their lives, because everything about the system is about taking away hope, taking away their dignity as human beings.
Pope Francis has reminded us that it is a cruel thing to take hope away from someone. And that's one of his concerns with the death penalty and even life imprisonment. In your own experience, Vicki, how were you able to bring hope to some of the people that you interact with?
Well, many of them in the prison system have come a long way into understanding what they did that got them in the situation and what impact over these years it has had on the families of the people that they murdered or that they had some serious interactions with. And they have learned through some of their work there, or some of the people that work with them there in the prisons, that they have to let go and try to move positively, ask for forgiveness from our Father in heaven, and also if they can interact with family members or other people that had suffered this terrible loss that they caused, they would like then to be able to communicate with them and to ask for forgiveness and to see if they can pray for them or help them out in other ways in their lives. And that's very amazing.
So our penal system as it's set up just looks backwards at the crime. It just looks at retribution. And obviously part of our understanding is a crime has been committed and there needs to be some punishment involved. But what you're talking about is something that looks forward, that's restorative.
Yes.
So Father, tell me, what is restorative justice to you, and how do you see it working better than some of the practices we currently undertake?
Well, I'd say it's clear that most of the men that I work with on death row have done terrible crimes, and they've hurt people, and the victims of their crimes have to live with tremendous scars and losses in their lives. So it's not that, and many of them will say that I deserve to be punished for what I did. The difference, I think, is when we're talking about punishment, they never stop being human. And so how do we take a person who has done a terrible thing and still continue to treat him or her as a human being with dignity and value? So restorative justice, in many cases, restorative justice is about mending the broken fabric of community. In many cases where the people I work with, there's no mending for what's broken. In terms of they're never getting out of prison, perhaps, but how can we help them heal, and how can we help them find a purpose in their lives and a dignity and grow spiritually, and at the same time, how do we help the victims of the crimes to recover, to experience healing, and often people talk about closure, and they're told that, well, if an execution happens, there'll be closure. But the reality is it doesn't close because the person they love is still going to be dead. And so the only way to really experience healing is through a process of forgiveness. And that may take a lifetime, but I think the restorative justice process in terms of death penalty, in terms of men and women on death row, is really about kind of a spiritual healing that has to happen both for them and for the victims of their crimes.
Right. And that is often some of the things lost in our system, is that the state takes the place of the victim. The victim is left out of the consideration. Maybe a victim impact statement is allowed in some cases, maybe not. But you're the surviving mother of a victim. And how does restorative justice bring the victim into the conversation?
Well, what I would like to see, and it could be helped with working with the prison system, because I have been trying for years and I've gotten a little progress along the way, is talking to the people that work in there, like what's equivalent to a social work, but a support group for the prisoners, is to say, I would like you to know, I'd like to talk to you and tell you what I'm trying to do, and can you help me, this is the person working there in the prison, help me connect with this person and be able to communicate with him and let him know that my feelings are there. First question she asked me, well, we don't let them talk to you if you're going to say mean things and spit at them and everything. I said, oh, no, that's not my intention at all. The real healthy part of this is that I can talk to him and just say, we are people of faith, we have forgiveness, and we want you to heal. It's very important that you also recover, and that we aren't here to be angry or vengeful in any way, shape, or form, and we pray for you every day. And if I would love this ways I can communicate with you and just realize you're a real person and you can hear from me and my family and what we feel all of this. And we've found that with many prisoners, that's very, very positive.
That is so important. Both the Old and the New Testament say that the Lord is very jealous on certain things. Two things he reserves to himself: judgment and vengeance. And our punishment should never be vindictive or vengeful. It is, at best, a retribution for the crime done, but it should involve also some move towards restoration. So in your case, Vicki, you've been able to exchange letters. We have. It took a very long time, but I was persistent, and I recommend if some other families going through this, don't give up. And they are more and more getting other programs in these new prisons that support this kind of activity. So yes, I took several years, but we got to be able to communicate. I really wanted to go visit him in person. I wanted him to see face to face the real sincerity of my body language and my face on how forgiving I was for him. We all come from such different backgrounds. We have such different experiences. How can I point a finger at somebody else who did a terrible thing when I don't know what was their background or what they have? We can't judge. That's not what God wants us to be doing. God wants us to forgive.
And it is so healthy. I've seen it time and time again, not only to my own daughter's murder, but to other people in prison, how positive that has an effect on them.
Right. And Father, you've seen part of this restorative justice, this restoration, is for people who have committed crimes to take responsibility. You're with many people who have been accused and have done very heinous crimes. How do you find that they look back at that? Do they take responsibility?
I would say most of them do. There are, of course, people who are broken, who are sociopaths in some way, and they're kind of missing a piece that makes them unable to I think, fully comprehend or acknowledge what happened. But for the majority of the men that I know, one of the things that they want most is forgiveness. And they want the people that they hurt to know of their desire for forgiveness, and they would like to hear from them, if possible. Even if it's not forgiveness, some sense of acknowledgement of their humanity.
Right. And this is one of the problems with the kind of mass incarceration that we're doing, is the penalty that we impose is a separation from community. Now, part of that is to defend the community against evil doing. We understand that. But the scriptures tell us, Jesus is very specific, I was in prison and you visited me. And that is to say that even the imprisoned need to feel and be part of our community. So how can we make that outreach as a church to those who are Jesus to us? I was in prison and you visited me. There's no getting around that. Right.
I know in the Middle Ages there were sodalities and confraternities of Catholic Christians who would go to prisons and they would go to the sites of executions and pray with the condemned. And this was something that was very popular among Christians at the time, because they were able to see in the prisoner Christ. And I think we've lost that in our culture. As you were saying, it's God who is the judge, it's God who brings vengeance, but we have taken it upon ourselves to play God. And I think that's the difference between us and perhaps the medieval Christians who saw Christ in the prisoners and went out on their own to give them comfort. I think if we could find a way to recapture some of that compassion as Catholic Christians and realize that it's in our power to witness to Christ by visiting these men and women in prison, and get away from sort of the cultural narrative that talks about vengeance and punishment. I think that we would regain perhaps part of our own tradition that we've allowed to falter.
Yes.
And I think a lot of that is education. I mean, they just making sure as much any way possible. Through some good movies that are being made that talk about this situation, through groups that can go in and talk with them, that have visiting rights, and they can go talk with these people. And let the prisoner know and see that, he or she isn't a restricted person or isn't counted out as not of any value or any of those negative feelings and we have to, this is something we can change. We have to be out there and active, and that's a very big priority now, because just as Father George says, this is getting to be worse and worse, I think.
Right. Now, Father, you said we can't play God, but yet we still, in the United States, unlike almost any first world country in the world, have the death penalty, at least on the books, and in some places actively still in use. What's a Catholic argument against the death penalty?
Well, I think Pope Francis has been very clear, as was Pope Benedict, as was St. John Paul II, that it's not necessary. The only justification earlier was that we needed to execute people in order to protect society from this person continuing to do crimes. But we don't need that anymore. We can keep people safely locked up without being a threat to society anymore. So I think the greatest argument is, if we claim to be a people who are pro-life, that means all human life, from the time of conception to the time of death, and not just natural death, but death. We can't bring about a human being's death. Innocent or guilty, they're still human beings. And I think I would encourage Catholics who to see that the right to life applies to men and women on death row as well. That we have to broaden our understanding of what that means to include all human beings and the dignity of all human beings.
And as someone that obviously, if anybody had the right to call for the death penalty, it's the mother of a murder victim.
Right.
What would be your argument against the use of the death penalty?
I think my biggest argument is, well, there's 3 or 4, they kind of link together. You know, more and more we're seeing that mistakes are being made. And we find out, you know, like every month or 2, we find out somebody was, you know, wrongly charged for a crime, and it may be 15, 20, 25 years later, the evidence comes forward, and they are let go.
And we saw that in Illinois. When I was there working, 13 were wrongfully accused on death row.
And just think what that takes out of their lives. All their work history, the pensions from their retirement, what they can do with their lives to rebuild, that is a very big cross to have to carry. Another thing I think we can do is find ways that we can learn more about forgiveness. I wish people could, you know, because if everybody can, we can all look at something in our lives, or even people we know and love that we're through, and say, oh, I don't want to be defined by that horrible thing I did. You know, I know of women that have had abortions in later years and years will just regret it, and it really tears them apart. Why did I do that? Why did I do that? So we all know that our Father forgives us for these things, and we know if we can work to do what our Father is doing to all of us who ask His forgiveness, then we can open the doors and windows and make life a lot better for a lot of people in it right now in our society.
Right. I always make the argument with my classes as I teach the Church's social teaching that our teaching on life is pretty straightforward. And it is that every human person is created in the image and likeness of God. And so from the moment of conception to natural death, we should never directly intend to kill. And that's the big difference with the death penalty. We always have to intend the death of the person being executed. This is different than what happens in a military situation or in a policing situation where the police officer or the person acting in a just war is stopping unjust aggression. Just to make it simple, using the police officer example, a police officer who ends up using force against a kidnapper or someone who's threatening innocent others, as soon as they've stopped the aggressor, they're calling the ambulance. They don't want the person dead. They just want them stopped. And they only use the force necessary to stop them from their unjust aggression and their real threat. But once they are pacified, as they say, then you call in the ambulance, you keep the person alive, you do everything you can to make sure that person doesn't die. It's a much different act in the act of execution. The intent of all involved, the judge who sentences, the jury who came to the sentence, the district attorney who argues for the sentence, all those involved in the actual carrying out of the sentence, which includes the housing of the person on death row, all of them, if they're involved in the system, have to intend at some stage that that person in front of them is dead. And they won't have successfully done their job if that person isn't dead at the end of the process. That is an anti-life choice. And as a society, we ought not to make anti-life choice. Plus, I think it also teaches that death sometimes is the solution to problem, in this case of crime. And we don't want to tell people in problem pregnancies or towards the end of their life that death is a solution to problems, because that teaches the wrong lesson. It teaches an anti-life lesson. So I don't know, I guess, you know, we have to find ways to convince people to join us in this effort. Yes,
and I think I bet on a couple panels recently, one at American University, and they brought in an executioner who was the state executioner, and he had executed 62 people. And he says he couldn't tell his wife didn't know about this, and that was the way they work it out. I guess they say don't tell your family members what your work is, but he just explained very, very, very personally and passionately how much of a toll this was taking on him all the years as this been out. And every time he would pray before he pushed that button, that please God, don't let this button work if this person didn't do that crime, you know. And it just built up into him in all sorts of ways that it just took so much of life out of him, he said, you know. And people don't realize the other repercussions of implementing some of these very, very difficult judgments, kinds of, positions where the state says you have to do this, put someone to death or this.
See how highly problematic it is. The state even says, hide this from your spouse.
Yeah, isn't that something?
That they, that this is so shameful in a way.
I couldn't have said that better.
That it has to be hidden even from your spouse.
Yes.
Well, we've also chosen to hide it from everybody else, making it invisible and sort of medicalizing it so it doesn't look like an execution. But it's profoundly...
Instead in the middle of the night often.
Yeah, and it's profoundly dehumanizing for everyone involved. And I think part of what we don't take into account is the toll that it takes on the people who work in prisons as well.
Oh, yes.
That's an important word, Father, dehumanizing, because much of what restorative justice is about is to bring back into a situation that had a lot of inhumane things happen, that humanity. So how does the restorative justice process rehumanize the situation?
Well, first, by acknowledging the humanity of the people involved. I think when you're talking about often the way people are described in public discourse around crime is it's not as human beings, but as they're murderers, they're animals, they're described by the crime. And that's the problem, I think, that I see often in the prison, is that we reduce a person to the worst thing he or she has ever done. But they're not what they've done. They're still human beings who have done bad things. But just like any of us, none of us would want to be defined by our worst mistake. And so I think part of what restorative justice does is it reminds us of our fundamental human dignity that we all share.
And I wish that there would be some support system within the prison walls for people that we knew has done very, very bad things for which they got the death penalty for, like my daughter's murder. And you talk to some of these people and then they tell you, oh, gee, how they were raised and the horrible things that happened in their families. And I've met so many fellow murder victims' families who tell me, oh, but that could have been my child. And we talk about that. Well, we had a beautiful family. Look what he grew up in. And if people there in the prison then could get some support kind of conversations with them, or you can call that a little social work kind of stuff, and to say, can you tell me about all this? Why do you think you got to the point where you did this?
Right, and this is one of the things. Sister Helen, right?
Yeah,
in our conversation with Sister Helen Pridejean, she realized that there's also a need to reach out to the family of the accused, and you've talked with the mother of the before she passed of your daughter's murderer.
Yes, and it was very, very, very emotional. If you can imagine, I had just planned, I sought a long time to be able to get a phone number and be able to talk to her, first of all. We had to identify who the killer was, and that took 4 or 5 years. But then when I was able to, they got permission for me to ask her son if I could call the mother and the brother, and he agreed. And so I had their phone numbers, and then I was able to talk to them. And it's part of the work. I knew it as a social worker. You have to tell them, just be very careful when you reach out to them and you're talking to them, that you don't come across as someone that, boy, I finally got to be angry and I'll tell you what I really think of you, kind of thing. But just to assure the people there in the prison and their support systems that this is not an angry call. This is to tell them that we are calling to say that, that God has forgiven them too, I am sure, but we certainly as a family have. And we have no hard feelings, and since we've been able to heal, we pray every day that you are able to heal too, and know that we aren't sitting out there still hating you and are bitter and vengeful and everything else. And I have met so many families who've gotten permission to make that call, and every one of them will come back and say, oh, I'm so glad you told me about this, and it's healed so much. Because so much of the time, the people who are in the prisons for those crimes have had horrible childhoods, horrible family lives, and there's no way they had any control of that. They were born into that in most cases that I've met, anyway. So I wish we could help them from the inside now that they have to be accountable, they have to make, they'll serve their term or whatever, but they can know we really love them and support them and pray for them and would do anything possible to help them.
That's fantastic. We've been talking about the death penalty and our work to oppose the death penalty, the great work that the Catholic Mobilizing Network is doing. We've been also talking about this new movement, which is an ancient one rooted in Catholic and biblical principles of restorative justice, of trying to look at the situation holistically and bring a restoration of relationships involved, the healing of those relationships broken by crime and other sins that have ruptured these relationships. I want to thank Father George for his great work in the California penal system at San Quentin, for Vicki for her heroic work in giving witness to the Church's teaching on life. I'm Msgr Stuart Swetland. Thank you for watching.